All I've ever wanted was a family, a friend, maybe even a partner. But everywhere I go, I bring chaos, destruction, pain, and death. I've accepted that it's my fate to walk this road alone. There are forces beyond me that control my destiny. Because I may look like any other goat on the outside. But me, I'm Judas. We are in a state of emergency. These islands are the last Eden on Earth, the inspiration behind Darwin's theory of evolution, and they are currently under a massive threat. Not from war or nuclear weapons or even natural disasters, but from an unexpected enemy, the goats. Yes, I said the goats. The goats are destroying the native species and their natural habitat by eating away all the vegetation and stripping these lands dry. Our conservationists and evolutionary biologists have struggled to find a peaceful solution to end this environmental massacre. But unfortunately, the only way to save these islands is complete and absolute eradication. Kill the goats, and kill them all. The Galapagos Islands are an archipelago located around 900 kilometers west of Ecuador and are considered to be one of the most isolated places on Earth. They're well known for the giant tortoises, of course, which can live over 150 years and weigh over 200 kilos, a natural marvel in its own right. But besides the famous tortoises, the Galapagos Islands are also known to be the home of a large number of endemic species with unique characteristics that develop specifically in adaptation of inhabiting these isolated lands. As far and exotic these islands seem, however, they're no strangers to human contact. It's debated whether the Incas ever explored the islands in the pre-Columbian era, but European voyages to Galapagos can be traced all the way back to the 1500s. Between the 1500s to the early 20th century, the islands were used as a base for pirates, whalers, and all kinds of explorers who introduced many non-native animals during their visits. These pirates and whalers brought goats on their ships and released them into the wild so that they'll have a meat supply when they come back, while in the later centuries, goats were introduced as livestock. By the 1970s, the goats were everywhere. They may be harmless herbivores to the average person, but out of all the non-native species introduced to the islands by humans, the goats were by far the most destructive. They devoured the vegetation and displaced the native animals from their feeding grounds. They eroded the soil and destroyed the biodiversity. So by the time the 90s rolled around, the giant tortoise and the other native fauna and flora were in big trouble. In 1995, the Tortoise Summit was organized by the Charles Darwin Foundation, where they discussed the giant tortoise being on the brink of extinction and pushed for an aggressive approach in restoring the population. This aggressive approach eventually developed into Project Isabella, which called for the eradication of all goats, donkeys, and pigs in all the islands. And when they said eradication, they really meant eradication. In 1999, The project went into action with hunters on the ground, but the team eventually expanded their operation by bringing in sharpshooters in helicopters. 2 gunmen would be on either side of the helicopter and herd the goats into a group. Once they're all together, they would open fire. This method was extremely successful, and 90% of the goat population were killed within the first years of the project. But there were still survivors, and the remaining goats learned quickly to be wary of these humans coming in from the ground and from the sky. Many of them hid inside tunnels, caves, and bushes, and the last 10% became increasingly difficult to find and kill. Enter the Judas Goat. Arguably one of the most infamous figures within the story of Christianity, Judas was a disciple and one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ. His name would become associated with deception and treason as he betrays Jesus and leads him into his arrest and crucifixion. Despite his betrayal and the many biblical stories that state his greedy motives, however, he is somewhat of a controversial figure within Christian theology because his actions set in motion the ultimate salvation of humanity through Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Judas Goat is a term for trained goats used in animal herding, and as the name suggests, they're trained to lead other animals to a certain destination, most often to their own slaughter. They're used to lead sheep or cattle into trucks that will transport them to their death, or sometimes straight into the slaughterhouse while their own lives are spared to live another day. For Project Isabella, the Judas Goat was their final strategy in exterminating the remaining 10% of feral goats that survived on the islands. Because goats are social animals, they naturally sought after one another when left on their own. So what Project Isabella did was gather a select few, sterilize them, fit them with tracking collars, and release them back into the islands to find their friends. Once they found a herd, the hunters would track them down using the collars and kill every goat except the Judas Goat so that it could be used once again to find more hidden herds. A few of the goats were eaten by the hunters as meat, but most of the corpses were left to decompose back into the soil. Over 140,000 goats were killed between 1997 to 2006, and Project Isabella is still to this day one of the largest and most aggressive environmental restoration projects to be executed in history.
잠깐. 제시카 외동딸 일리노이 시카고 과선배는 김치모 그는 네 사촌.
In Bong Joon-ho's 2019 film Parasite, we are introduced to a poor family and a rich family. Initially, the title seems to be associated with a poor family who lie their way into employment by the rich family. They make up work experience and credentials they never had in order to get employed, and they even plot against a housekeeper to take her job too. Throughout the film, however, you slowly see that this rich family really doesn't know or doesn't care to do anything for themselves. They may be paying the poor family with money they have too much of, but in exchange, they get to take their labor, their time, their dignity, their lives. The poor family is ecstatic at first to have swindled their rich employers into getting a job because it's a matter of survival after all. But ultimately, they have to give their lives to this rich family in exchange for temporary survival. As terrible and tragic as Project Isabella and this entire situation sounds, it actually did work in terms of environmental restoration. The goats were treated as a parasitic presence on these islands, taking nutrients away and eroding the landscape. They didn't belong there, unlike the giant tortoise. After the goats were gone, the vegetation around the islands recovered, with many of the endangered endemic species coming back to life. the giant tortoise population also grew with the additional help of captive breeding. However, the goats may be eating all the plants, but the other reason why the giant tortoise population was dwindling by the 20th century was because of aggressive hunting done by humans. They may be a beloved national treasure now, but it's only within the last few decades that the public's thoughts on these animals shifted, and the hunters, whalers, pirates, and explorers who came before did not think of them in the same way. So we're technically correcting for human mistakes that have been made in the past, but ultimately, it's still not us who pay the price. It's the hundreds of thousands of other animals that lived on those islands for centuries who ended up there in the first place to be hunted and eaten. And now, all of a sudden, when we change our mind that the giant tortoises are important and the goats are not, all the goats get the bullet. The fate of entire species are swung back and forth at the whims of our preference for them. We get to decide what lives or dies here. The Judas Goat is a very interesting name for a peculiar role, in my opinion. Since Judas is associated with deception and betrayal, it does sound fitting for the role that the Judas Goat is expected to play. But obviously, they're goats. They have no power or say or even awareness in this matter. They don't know that they're leading the herd to their death, nor the fact that they're being used as a pawn for a larger game that a species stronger than them are playing. And even if they did, what are they going to do about it? Their fate to be alone was sealed as soon as they were tagged with that collar. And as for all the parasitic feral goats, they only ended up there for reasons beyond their control, and eventually they were wiped out by the very species that put them there. So in the end, who's the parasite? Who's the real Judas? So this was a bit dramatic, but I heard about Project Isabella and the whole story behind it from a friend recently, and it just really shocked me. Not just because of the amount of slaughter that happened so quickly, but also because of the pretty brutal techniques that they used and just the sheer demonstration of power that took place. But thank you for watching, and please leave a comment if you enjoyed the video and like and subscribe for more.